I know most of you are in business, and those of us in the economics profession aren't always the best at communicating our insights to people who are not in the same business. So I hope this is as jargon-free as possible and straightforward and relevant to your work. Got about 30 slides here. I hope they're reasonably straightforward. If anything is not clear to you, we've got plenty of time for questions afterwards. I know some people don't like asking questions in this sort of context. I know you marketing folk are not known to be shrinking violets, so I'm sure people will ask any questions. If you prefer not to, you can drop me an email to raise any questions about the presentation at that address there, and I will do my best to reply to you. But I would ask no questions about what to do with your Black Sea properties, the only rider on that. Good. So I'd like to start by just giving you a brief mapping out of the things I'd like to cover today. There are four areas. First, the background. As we all know, Ireland is a very open economy, and what goes on elsewhere has a major impact on what goes on in this country. So it's necessary to have a look at what's going on in the world and give some sort of assessment about the prospects for recovery, which there are some signs of now, and also the risks to the international economy if over the next year or so. Second thing, have a look at Ireland, stand back a little and look at some of the real fundamentals. A lot of talk of fundamentals during the boom years, particularly about property prices. There are good fundamentals in many areas in this country, and I think at a time like this it's important to look at the positives and not become excessively despondent. But at the same time, it's important not to ignore just how serious the situation is. And the situation in Ireland is more serious than peer countries. Third issue, why is that? Looking at some of the problems, not to sort of navel gaze, but to get out of the problems, I think one needs to understand quite clearly what the nature of those problems are. And finally, what are the prospects for recovery for this country? What are the issues that the country is facing? So, starting with the world economy. Again, to be somewhat positive, we can look at the world over the past 25 years, and we see that the size of the world economy has doubled. Every year, almost, the world economy has grown. And that has been way ahead of population growth. So it means standards of living across the world are rising. And that's the case for most people. There are parts of the world where that's not happening. But overall, the world has been on a very strong upward trend economically, and people's standards of living have been rising. Now, as you'll notice there, at the very end, if this pointer works here, 2009 is the first time since the Second World War where the world economy has contracted. It's the first time. Now, that's a very unusual occurrence. And the reason for that, as you all know, was the quite extraordinary collapse of the international financial system as we've known it over the past couple of decades. And it's difficult to understate the significance of that event. That has really changed our world. Every economy needs a financial system. A financial system is a little like, is to an economy what the cardiovascular system is to the human body, that it is, without it, other systems start shutting down. And that is what we're seeing there, that we're seeing this contraction in the world economy for the first time since the Second World War. And that will have big implications for everything for a considerable time to come. Now, to give you an idea of just how big a change this has been, let's look at how the world normally grows. So over the past 30 years, that's the average rate of expansion. So you see the world economy grows at about 3% a year. Now, we can see that after the second oil crisis, there was a serious recession. We see the dot-com boom. After that bubble burst, there was also a recession. But this is really like nothing anybody who's here has ever experienced. So this is really an extraordinary event. World economy is contracting by about 3% this year. Why is that happening? And this is particularly relevant to Ireland. Now, its cause is the collapse of the financial system, but that has had most impact on countries' exports. That is where it's really shown up, and there are many reasons for that. Companies are not able to get export financing. A lot of the things that are exported, like cars, very much based on credit to finance the purchases of those things. So it's exports that have borne the brunt so far of this change. And as you can see, the rate of growth of exports is a lot higher than GDP growth. So export growth, globalization, has been driving that growth in the world economy for a very long time. And now that has partially gone into reverse with a quite unprecedented contraction of 1/10 in exports trade among countries. And we can see this briefly in exports share of world GDP. So as we can see, from the mid-80s, it was very low, and there's been a pretty much constant increase over that time. And that's globalization, that exports become more important for economic growth. So that depicts pretty well globalization. But at the end, the final bar, you see just how much that's changed. So those countries that are export dependent have tended to be hit harder than other countries. Another aspect of globalization that's briefly worth mentioning because it's so relevant to this country is foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment has probably been an even more powerful driver of the globalization process. And this country has been extraordinarily successful in hitching its wagon to that process. And as you can see from the next slide, this is foreign direct investment on a global basis over the past 20 years or so. Now, this period here happens to be the same period, the real strength of the Celtic Tiger. And this is when global foreign direct investment increased at a very rapid rate, and Ireland was so well positioned to attract a lot of that because it had been in the investment attracting business long before most countries. In fact, up until the 70s and 80s, many countries were trying to prevent foreign companies from coming to their country, whereas Ireland's been in that business since the late 1950s. And did very well out of that. As we can see, foreign direct investment increased again throughout the course of this decade, and now there's been, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that's been a collapse. Now, we believe that it will recover. It will take time, and it's not going to recover this year or next, but it will recover. And that is another cause for optimism over the medium and long term for Ireland. We might discuss that a little more later on. How has this been distributed, the decline in growth across the world being distributed? And this is important for Ireland to have a look at which countries, particularly the countries that it exports to and deals with, which countries have been affected. And as we can see, those countries that export a lot have been very badly affected. That's their negative GDP. Instead of having growth, their economies will contract this year. And the US, despite being the epicenter of the global financial crisis, is a very big economy, and its exports account for a much smaller percentage of its economy. And it has actually suffered less, despite being, as I say, the epicenter of the crisis. Now, if we take out the export sector and we look at just what happens domestically in an economy, and this is important in a number of respects, we see the picture changes a little. This was the worst point of the crisis, the end of last year and the beginning of this year. So we look at what happened to various economies at that time, and we see that Britain, because of its big financial sector and because consumers are dependent on credit, the British economy contracted more than any of the other big economies last year. Now, that has implications for this country because it's still among the most important export partners for this country, particularly for indigenous companies. So Britain has got very serious problems, and that will clearly affect demand in that market for not just in the immediate period, but for some time to come, because those problems are not like Germany, where its domestic economy, as you can see at the bottom, is pretty solid. That means it can bounce back once export demand bounces back. But the UK has more fundamental domestic problems, which will take longer to work through. So that was the worst of the crisis. That was the period immediately after the collapse of Lehman Brothers in September, up until about Easter time, was the period where world trade collapsed, the financial system was at its weakest. Since then, there have been signs of things getting better. Some of the stronger economies, Germany and France, as you'll see, the countries that contracted least at the low point of the crisis, already returned to growth in the second quarter. And they're almost certain, the numbers have not come out, but it's almost certain that in the third quarter they grew even more strongly. We saw last week that the US in the third quarter began to grow again. Japan has begun to grow again. And the only country that didn't return to growth, the only big country, is the UK and Spain. And that is because both of those countries have those domestic problems that will take longer to work through. We also see in financial markets much a dissipation of the real fear that existed this time last year. To some extent, one could argue that has gone too far. Many prices of assets have risen, and there's the possibility, the risk, that there's a bubble. And that is one of the major risks we're looking at now, that there could be another bubble, and if that bubble bursts, we go back to the kind of fear that drove countries and that drove the crisis about this time last year. And that is a real risk. And there are other risks as well. A risk of the euro continuing to appreciate, certainly for this audience. That makes exports more expensive. And there are also all sorts of risks. Policymakers are really making all this up as they go along. There's a risk that they get it wrong and they make a mistake and they pitch the world economy or individual economies back into a crisis. So there's great uncertainty about how policymakers will work through this, and there's plenty of scope to get it wrong. So in summary, the world economy is starting to grow again. The worst appears to be past, but there are considerable risks, often described as a second dip in the economy or a W-shaped recession. We had the first dip, and then we get a second dip, and there is a real risk that could happen. Now, turning to Ireland and taking that step back, let's just have a look at Ireland's economic performance very briefly. This slide we saw earlier was the world economy, and we saw that growth has been around 3%. Now we add Ireland to that, and we see how well Ireland performed, particularly in the Celtic Tiger era in the late 90s, where Irish growth was quite exceptional. No already developed country has ever had that kind of an expansion. And much of that was based on real fundamentals, on solid, positive, export-led growth, something that raised incomes in this country above the level in most other developed countries, where they are now. Although we see that this period here, it's now absolutely clear that this was a bubble period, and the price is being paid. The size of the downturn in Ireland is far greater than other developed countries.